So, how do you top one of the best monster movies ever made and just one of the greatest films, period? The answer, and this applies for every Godzilla movie to follow, you don't. Godzilla Raids Again came out in April of 1954, just 6 months after the original Godzilla. It is directed by Motoyoshi Odo, stars Hiroshi Koizumi, Setsuko Wakayama, and Minoru Chiaki. The movie follows two pilots who work for a fishing company in Osaka. The two pilots are played by Hiroshi Koizumi and Minoru Chiaki. One of the pilots, Kobayashi, played by Minoru Chiaki, has an incident with his plane and he's forced to crash land near a deserted island. At least they think it's deserted, because once Hiroshi Koizumi's character comes in to help him, they encounter Godzilla, who everyone thought was dead. But it's made pretty clear soon after that this is a second Godzilla, thanks to Dr. Yamane's warnings at the end of the first movie. But he's also caught doing battle with Anguirus. So once the two pilots head back to the mainland, the entire nation is put on high alert, and it doesn't take long for Godzilla and Anguirus to find their way to Osaka and start tearing things up. It's another simple monster plot. There's not much else to it. So one thing I want to point out right now is how much King Kong and Godzilla are intertwined. I mean, obviously there'd be a Versus movie and a new one coming up in 2 years, but when you look at the first movie for each monster, they both are groundbreaking films in their own right. They're both considered one of the greatest films ever made, not only within the genre of monster movies. Not only did they introduce the two most iconic movie monsters ever created, but their sequels also share some similarities. Both Son of Kong and Godzilla Raids Again were both rushed into production soon after the first one was released, just so the general public would still remember the original movie. I reviewed Son of Kong last year and went over all the basics of that movie, and when you watch Godzilla Raids Again, it's very clear that this was rushed. For one thing, the movie tries to have the same dark, bleak tone that the original movie had, and there are some moments throughout the film that are very quiet and somber, and they can be effective. Unfortunately, it just feels like we've been down this road before. There are a lot of scenarios in this movie that feel very much like the first movie, even though the movie as a whole has a very different outcome in terms of the plot. And also, the bleak tone doesn't really quite work because this is a monster mash. This is the first Godzilla movie where he would fight another monster, a trait of these movies that would continue on for most of the films in the series. And because it's a monster mash, you just mainly want to see Godzilla and Anguirus fight each other and destroy buildings, rather than just being focused on the bleak atmosphere and how Godzilla is once again a metaphor for the nuclear bomb. Because the movie takes place in Osaka this time instead of Tokyo, and when the destruction in Osaka happens, it's all through the monsters fighting each other. We never see any characters in true peril like we did in the first one. There are no dark, bleak moments of a woman holding her two children saying, "We'll see your dad soon," and accepting death. The most you get are these three criminals that escape from jail and get drowned in a flood thanks to the two monsters fighting. But again, you don't feel anything because those are just criminals that ran away from arrest, and they're expendable in the long run. The characters are also kind of forgettable this time around. The movie tries to recreate the love triangle that was in the original Godzilla, but unfortunately, the way the script is written, it has the characters just going about their own daily lives. They don't really show how these two monsters fighting has affected these characters the way it did in the first Godzilla, because the scene that follows Godzilla and Anguirus' fight throughout Osaka, the main characters just go, "Damn, our headquarters are destroyed. Oh well, time to move up to Hokkaido." The monsters are just more of a nuisance that get in the middle of their daily lives rather than something that they feel like they have to play a big part in. And it really is a clear sign that Ishiro Honda did not direct this movie, because Honda would have made the characters proactive within the film's plot. In fact, after the original Godzilla, Ishiro Honda's next movie was a love story. Then the year after that, he would officially get back into the giant monster genre with Rodan and many other movies to follow, which I've already reviewed. But getting back to the film's love triangle, we have Hiroshi Koizumi, who is a pretty regular familiar face when it comes to classic Toho science fiction movies, especially when it comes to Godzilla and Mothra. We have Setsuko Wakayama, who plays Hiroshi Koizumi's girlfriend, and then we have Minoru Chiaki, who is a Kurosawa regular. He was one of the 7 samurai in Seven Samurai, and he was one of the 2 peasants in The Hidden Fortress, and Godzilla Raids Again is his only science fiction film. And again, the love triangle here doesn't really amount to much. It's in the background once again, but it's not in a way that the original movie utilized its love triangle, where it's in the background, but when it comes into the foreground, it's used to further the plot. In this movie, it's in the background, and when it pops up, you're just like, why do I care? This doesn't really feed into the actual plot of the movie. And just like with Serizawa, Minoru Chiaki's character, Kobayashi, is killed, but it's more like an accident than anything. Serizawa sacrificed himself so that the oxygen destroyer could not be recreated because he feared that it could be a weapon worse than the H-bomb or Godzilla. But as for Kobayashi, he's continuously flying his plane towards Godzilla to try to get his attention, and by the 3rd time he attempts this, Godzilla's had enough of this shit and blasts his plane out of the sky with his atomic breath, and Kobayashi's plane crashes into the mountainside, and you're like, huh, that sucks, but that doesn't really mean anything other than it sucks. There's really no emotional weight to this death scene the way there was with Serizawa's death in the original Godzilla. Some of the more important parts of this movie are pretty flawed, no question about it, but it's not to say that this movie's dull in any way, because it's very entertaining. It's the first Godzilla movie where he fights another monster. The fight scenes in this movie are pretty impressive, and a lot of the special effects and miniatures are really well done considering the movie's rushed schedule. The Godzilla suit was made to be much slimmer and was made out of a lighter material than the suit in the original one was, because Haruo Nakajima this time had to do more physical action in order to fight Anguirus, who was actually played by Katsumi Tezuka, who was another suit actor for Toho, and he was the suit actor that was originally set to play Godzilla, and there were a few points where he did do tests in the suit, but ultimately Haruo Nakajima ended up playing Godzilla in that movie. So having Tezuka play Anguirus against Nakajima as Godzilla is kind of like a neat rivalry, but there are some points in the fight scenes where they come across as bizarre. I mean, you have the hand puppets to show the monsters biting each other. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when the monsters start moving like crazy. This goes into other similarities with Son of Kong. When you watch Son of Kong, you can admire how good the stop motion animation is considering that it was rushed, but you can definitely see that it was rushed. With the production on Godzilla Raids Again, there were 3 cameras that were set to record the fight scenes. And one of the big things that you have to take into consideration when watching monster movies that require suit actors is that in order to show the monster's size and to show how giant they are, you have to shoot at high-speed photography because that eventually slows down the action and makes the monsters a little more bulkier. Like I mentioned, 3 cameras were filmed for the fight scenes. One of the cameras was accidentally set for slow speed photography. So when Eiji Tsuburaya eventually looked at the dailies and saw that one of the cameras was set at that speed and saw all the hyperkinetic action when it came to the Godzilla and Anguirus fight scene, it looked weird. And when you watch the movie, it is a little bizarre, but on one hand, it does make the monsters appear that much more vicious. But on the other hand, again, it's hard to imagine that monsters that big would be able to move that quickly. It just doesn't look realistic. With the final battle in the end, this is one of the few times that the Japanese self-defense force actually defeats Godzilla on their own without some super weapon or another monster. The plan for the final battle was to bury Godzilla underneath a bunch of ice so that he basically goes into hibernation. And it's a pretty cool and creative idea. One problem I have with this sequence, though, is that there's a point when the Japanese self-defense force gets the idea to shoot the sides of the mountains and have the ice collapse on Godzilla. But then they take a break, head back to base, refuel, and go over the plan again. And it just creates a lull in the action. It slows the pace down, and that gives Godzilla enough time to basically get out of the ice just crawl out and become a big problem again. So that little part of the final sequence I had an issue with, but again, it's one of the more inventive and creative ways to take out Godzilla. One last thing I want to bring up before I wrap things up with this review is the music. Akira Ifukube didn't do the score this time around. Instead, it's Masaru Sato, who would eventually become Akira Kurosawa's regular composer for The Hidden Fortress, Yojimbo, Sanjuro, and he would score other Godzilla movies like Ebirah, Horror of the Deep, Son of Godzilla, and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. And in this movie, his score is just not really that impressive. At this point, he was still a very new composer, so he had yet to find his voice. Sometimes the score can be very effective, but again, it's not too memorable of a score. It doesn't really haunt you or leave any memorable iconic themes the way Akira Ifukube does. At least if we're just comparing this score to the score of the original Godzilla movie and not Ifukube's entire catalog. So to sum things up, Godzilla Raids Again is okay. The human side of the story is definitely lacking because the human characters don't really seem to be all that bothered by the monster action. They just find it as a disturbance from their daily lives. The grim tone that this movie's trying to replicate is not really there because it's a monster mash. But that being said, all the special effects sequences are really well done considering the rush time restraints, and it's entertaining. So I would say watch at your own risk. Because of the human elements, I can't really recommend it fully, but you won't be bored watching this movie, especially if you just watch it for the Godzilla and Anguirus sequences. And Anguirus is just one of the best Godzilla monsters ever made. He's really inspired, and he would be one of the most iconic Godzilla monsters ever made. So yeah, not terrible, not even bad, but nothing that truly stands out. What is terrible, however, is the American version of Godzilla Raids Again, Gigantis The Fire Monster. You could tell easily by the name of the movie why I feel like this is terrible. So this version of Godzilla Raids Again came out in the States in 1959, and much like with Godzilla King of the Monsters, it was heavily re-edited for American audiences, and I feel like there might be less alterations with this movie, but because the alterations in this movie are so bizarre and so unnecessary, it feels like a completely different movie. For one, the producers, for whatever reason, there actually is a reason, they decided to rename Godzilla to Gigantis. The reasons that this change was made was because the American distributors of this version, Warner Brothers, who funny enough distributes the MonsterVerse movies with Godzilla and Kong, they said that they couldn't get the rights to Godzilla's name from the producers of Godzilla King of the Monsters, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then the producer of this version said that they renamed the monster Gigantis because they didn't want it to be confused with Godzilla, except that it is Godzilla, so that doesn't make any kind of sense at all. And then they replace a good chunk of Masaru Sato's score in this movie. I mean, granted, Masaru Sato's score is not one of his greatest, but what they replace it with is some of the cheesiest B-movie music that was around at the time. Usually it was stock music from other science fiction movies that Warner Brothers distributed. And given that this movie attempted to recreate the dark tone of the original, the music that they chose for this version doesn't add up at all. It doesn't fit. Because at least with Godzilla King of the Monsters, they were respectful enough to keep the Ifukube score. And then the dialogue in a lot of the movie is not a direct translation at all from the original Japanese dialogue. The dialogue will be changed drastically in certain scenes, and sometimes it'll be changed to try to match the actor's lip movement, just so it doesn't look out of sync. And this leads into some pretty memorable and iconic lines. That's all sarcasm. The most famous with this movie is banana oil. So one of the voice actors in this version of the film was George Takei. This was before he became Sulu on Star Trek. And he said a couple of times that everyone laughed when the banana oil line was spoken, because basically it's supposed to be slang for bullshit, but apparently it was slang that was even outdated in the 50s. It's like when you watch Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, can't even believe I'm bringing up this example, but when you hear Skids and Mudflap say, "I'm gonna put a cap in his ass," it's like, that's slang that nobody says for 2009. But back to Gigantis the Fire Monster, getting back to a lesser piece of shit. There isn't much I have to say about this. I'm still vastly confused on why they renamed Godzilla Gigantis. Oh, not to mention that a lot of the sound effects for the monsters are switched around. Like, you'll hear Godzilla belching out Anguirus's roar and vice versa. So there are just so many bizarre changes in this movie, and this was actually the toughest watch. I'm halfway through the series as I'm recording this, and rewatching Gigantis The Fire Monster after a long time was probably the toughest watch I had to do for this series. And when I originally reviewed these movies on my old channel, I gave Gigantis The Fire Monster my Burn in Hell rating. But watching it again, I just kind of felt about it, and there were some unintentionally funny moments watching it. And plus, I'd be getting pissed off at an American version to one of the lesser Godzilla movies. If this was the American version of the original 1954 Godzilla, sure, I'd be pissed off. I'd tell this movie to go burn in hell. But as it stands now, since Godzilla Raids Again is not one of the strongest movies, just don't waste your money on this one. If you gotta pick between one version, pick the Japanese version. Always pick the Japanese version. Well, not always, but we'll get to that little area when I get to it. And that's my review for Godzilla Raids Again and Gigantis the Fire Monster. Because this movie was not really too well received, the Godzilla series was put on a hiatus, and this allowed time for Toho to really practice the science fiction genre with movies like Rodan, The Mysterians, Varan, Battle in Outer Space, Mothra, all of which I reviewed 2 years ago during Toho month, so you can definitely check out those reviews. And then in 1962, Toho would bring back Godzilla in probably one of the most, if not the most, iconic versus movie ever made, King Kong vs. Godzilla. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. So until tomorrow, I hope you enjoyed this review. Leave a comment down below and tell me what your thoughts are on the movie, if and when you've seen it. And as always, this is the Real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one.